Recording has started.
Yes, yeah. So, so we welcome Professor Bhate to give his first lecture in this annual foundation school, and he will be lecturing on complex analysis. So, Professor Bhate.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you for calling me, inviting me to give these lectures, both Professor Joshi and Professor Kadu and Professor Katre, and of course Pawan for making all these arrangements possible. So it is a pleasure to give these series of lectures. I have not talked about complex analysis online earlier. Okay. So as usual, this online giving lectures online is a bit of a learning experience for both the teachers and the students. And especially in my case, whenever I sort of give a lecture, I usually make students try and do something, and I go around peering over their shoulders to see what they have written. And this is a bit difficult to do online. Okay. So I'll have to see what to substitute for that, and then hopefully
Yeah,
people
means
will.
list of the students is there, participants is there.
Yeah.
So yeah, so one can look at that at least, and you can ask them to unmute themselves and say something if you
Okay,
like.
but I have 32, but I can see names only of so much. So if I go on this, I should be able to get all the names. Okay.
Yes,
This way.
yes, you can
Okay,
see.
that's how I get everyone's names.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Okay.
So, we have quite a few. We are supposed to do a lot of stuff as usual, and we'll have to see how it goes. But and the idea behind these lectures is not to so-called cover a syllabus, but the idea is to sort of make you think in a certain manner, which you probably had not spent time thinking about earlier. The first point is that complex analysis is a very geometric, pictorial subject, which you have probably not been forced to think about earlier. What gets mapped to what? This object, this region gets mapped to that region. There's a certain geometry involved. Okay, a straight line maps to a circle, or this real and imaginary parts. Look at these contours. The contours are orthogonal. These kind of things, which are actually very important in complex analysis, are usually not very well emphasized when you learn these things the first time. So I hope that I will be able to spend a great deal of time talking about this kind of geometry. And I believe people will find it is not, again, computations that we're going to do are not particularly difficult. What is difficult is to think about those computations in some kind of geometric manner. And from what I hear yesterday, this was again one of those, this is the first time that you have a tutorial in a class, okay, problem session in a class before the class has begun. And yesterday, I think you were asked to do some kind of little bit of geometric thinking. And my feedback was that a lot of you had difficulty talking in those terms. What is the reflection in a plane? What is the imaginary part of something greater than zero? What is the positive part of that line, etc., etc. This sort of ideas are, again, ideas are things that you must learn how to think about. So today I'm not going to be doing very much, but as usual, there are some ideas here involved. And I hope there are not too many ideas, but from next time onwards, we'll spend more time talking about the actual geometry of what one is saying. At least next time onwards, when I talk about these, what are called the fractional linear transformations, which I think you should spend some time talking about fractional linear transformations, because that is what allows you to map points to certain pre-specified points. Come to that later. Okay, so what is it that we are talking about? Okay, not this. Where is it? Where is my sharing thing? This is not what I want. Oh, I minimize this. Yeah, I hope I can see the screen. This is the first, I think, yeah, it has a red line around it. So it is being shared, and this also I'll minimize so you can, it's gone. Okay, so the first thing we have to understand is what do we mean by differentiation, complex differentiable at a particular point. Okay, if this limit, the usual limit with h tends f is a function from omega, which is a subset of C, an open subset of C, and we say it is differentiable at some point z naught. If that limit, the usual derivative that we think about when you have real numbers to real numbers. Remember, let me emphasize this again. H is a complex number. The small increment h is a complex number, and therefore complex numbers form a field. Therefore, I can talk about 1 over h, and then I take f z naught plus h minus f z naught multiplied by 1 over h and find the limit when h tends to 0. Okay, no big deal. So this is my definition of a function being differentiable at a point. Okay, and then we say that it is holomorphic on omega. If it is holomorphic at, so I should say this is holomorphic, which is complex differentiable, to distinguish it from real differentiable. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time today trying to make you understand that there is something to be understood even when you're talking about real differentiability. Okay. So this limit is denoted by f prime at z naught, and f is holomorphic if it is holomorphic at each point in z naught. And immediately you see that the complex numbers can be identified with R2, namely you take the real part and the complex part of that number, imaginary part of the number, and therefore every z in C can be identified with xy in R2. Okay, the ordered pair, the vector xy is in R2, each component x and y, the real and imaginary parts of z is in R, each real numbers. Okay, and therefore a function from C to C can also be thought about as a function from R2, that is the first C, to the R2, which is the second C, namely f of z, z is x plus iy, you call that as f of x comma y, and on the right hand side you have u plus iv, I don't think I've come to the u plus iv there, which is the real part of z and the imaginary part of z. Okay, so you have a map f tilde, which is from R2 to R2, where f tilde, okay, its image consists of the imaginary part of f, comma, the real part of f, the real part of f, comma, the imaginary part of f, u, comma, v. Okay. So we have this, a complex valued function of a complex variable can also be thought of as a function from R2 to R2. And when you have functions from R2 to R2, I mean, obviously you can talk about differentiability of these functions. Which differentiability? Real differentiability of these functions. So, there's this distinction between holomorphic and differentiability. But when you talk about differentiability, you usually mean differentiability as functions from R2 to R2. So, the question is that what is the meaning of the derivative of the function f from R2 to R2? Okay, what is the definition of the derivative? And just to sort of, I hope you will understand that you have to be careful with this question, okay? Because if you tell me something, then the next question I'm going to ask is what is the meaning of the second derivative? So here itself, for functions from R2 to R2, one has to get the idea of what you mean by derivative clarified, okay? And I don't know how I'm going to make you sort of understand that there is something to be done here. So what is the second derivative, okay, of a function from R2 to R2? Let me just pause here. How many of you can tell me what the second derivative? Here we are. When I go here and type a name. Okay, so I just want to make a little bit of a fuss about this, that if you have a function from R2 to R2, what is the meaning of the derivative in the real as function from R2 to R2? What is the meaning of the real derivative of f at a point? Can one of you tell me? So the derivative of f at the point 1, 2 is what?
So Ishan has raised the hand. He wanted to say
Ishan, where is
something.
Ishan? Ishan, see more. Yeah, what is it?
Yes, that was to answer what the derivative is.
Yeah, what is it?
Yeah, it's a linear map. So the
From?
derivative at P,
Yeah, go ahead.
derivative at P is a linear map satisfying the following approximation. And you write
Linear map from where to where? 1 minute. Linear map from where to where?
R2 to R2.
Okay.
The derivative at P. And when you, the derivative at P is a linear map from R2 to R2 such that f of P plus H minus f of P is dfp of H. dfp is the linear map plus R of H. And R of H satisfies that R of H over H with the norms, with the respective norms close to 0.
Okay, very good. So it's the same thing, only the derivative is a linear map from R2 to R2. Very good. What is the second derivative at a point?
Yeah, so you get a linear map now from R2 to HOM R2 to R2. Okay, and that
HOM is a bit fancy word to use. Okay. Don't use HOM. You should use
linear maps from R2 to linear maps from R2 to R2.
Okay, very good. So the second derivative is at a point is a linear map from R2 to linear maps from R2 to R2. Very good. Okay, so this is what I wanted to get out of you. At least someone knows this. The question is, how do you calculate it? Okay. So have any of you calculated the second derivative of a function? R2 to R2 is slightly confusing because both are R2s. So you take a function from R2 to R3. Okay, take a function from R2 to R3 and calculate the second derivative at a point. Now, have any of you done this ever?
Yeah, so we will be having.
What do you get?
Yeah, we will be having a matrix, so 3x2 matrix. And each of the entries will be the partial derivative. So
yes,
we have to evaluate it at that point. So
that's the first derivative. What about the second derivative?
So we take the second partial derivatives of order.
And how do you arrange them?
Yeah, so you have the coordinates x1, x2, x3 in R3.
Yeah.
I mean, you will be having f1, f2, f3 in R3.
Yes. Yes.
In R2, you will be having x1, x2. So
yes,
with respect to each of those, we will have combinations of like 6 partial derivatives, and we will arrange them in columns and evaluate them.
Which columns? So do you understand now what you're saying is correct? Okay.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful of how you choose your bases. Okay. So you have to arrange them in a column. How do you arrange those things into a matrix is the question. Okay. And it is quite confusing actually. So I've given one of these exercises here, which I'm asking you to calculate the second derivative of something at some point, etc., etc. And I hope you will do this, okay? Because it will clear up. I'm very glad that someone has seen this earlier, but it will try to calculate that is going to clear up a lot of ideas, okay? So the higher order real derivatives are going to be the third order derivative of a function from R2 to R2 is going to be at a point. So third order derivative of a function at a point is a linear map from R2 to linear maps from R2 to linear maps from R2 to R2. Okay, so I'm going very fast over all this, and this needs some understanding. Okay, how do you calculate it? So this is one thing about the real differentiability. But you know that if you have a complex function d by dz of e to the z is e to the z is a complex number. And d2 by dz squared of e to the z is again e to the z, which is also a complex number. The third derivative of e to the exponential of z is exponential of z so the third derivative of the exponential of z at a point a is e to the a, which is a complex number. Okay. So the question that you should be thinking about, or should have spent some time thinking about here, is that your linear algebra, your differentiability of functions from R2 to R2, the second derivative and so on, the higher order derivatives of function from R2 to R2 are getting the values of that take values in different spaces. Whereas when I'm talking about complex the differentiability, holomorphicity that I've talked about here, the higher order derivatives are just complex numbers. Okay. And there seems to be a problem here. Do you at least see that there is some kind of question to be asked here? Yes? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Yeah, someone has raised a hand. I don't know who. Who is this?
So I have raised my hand.
Yeah.
Because you said that there seems to be a discrepancy. But I think that discrepancy can be resolved. You see, when you're talking about derivatives from C to C, and you're saying that it's a real number, well, that's because you're saying that the derivative.
No, complex number. Derivative from C to C is a complex number.
Yes, sorry. When you're saying it's a complex number, I believe you can also identify it with a linear map by checking, and then you get back to the same thing of having maps from a space to the Hauptmann.
But no. The trouble is that in that case, if you look at your complex businesses, if you look at the real complex business, a real differentiation, the spaces you're getting are linear maps from R2 to linear maps from R2 to R2. Yeah. Okay, that is not the same as linear maps from R2 to R2.
Probably we need a equivalent criteria when R linear map is a C linear map.
So there's something to be done there. Okay. Yeah. There's an understanding that you have to make, which identifies these things with those multilinear maps, which you should think about. Okay. So when can a linear map from R2 to R2 be identified with? A real linear map and the complex linear map. So there is some linear algebra involved here. Okay. And that linear algebra itself is quite interesting. And I hope you will see this at some point of time. But again, that is sort of going a bit out of the way. But the point here is that there is a connection between complex, this holomorphic business that I'm saying, complex derivatives and real derivatives of functions from R2 to R2. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And you have to identify how these things actually see each other. So please think about this. Okay, that how do you identify these two different things? The real differentiability of a function from R2 to R2, the complex differentiability of a function from C to C, and the higher order derivatives that you can talk about here. Okay, there's something to be understood there. Okay, so why is this not minimizing? It's minimized. Okay. So that's what I meant by these questions that I'm putting here, that where is a function from R2 to R2 differentiable, and what is the derivative at a point, etc., etc. Okay, what is the second derivative, where does that exist, and why do these kind of things, why do the problems that you're having here when you're talking about real derivatives, why do those problems not arise when you're talking about complex derivatives? Okay, so there's something here, there's something here that there's a certain identification that you have to be worried about. Okay, and what are the examples? Of course, you know that fz equal to z is holomorphic, fz equal to z bar is not holomorphic. The power series is holomorphic. We'll come to that a little bit later on. And if f is holomorphic, then you get the Cauchy-Riemann equation. You know, I'm not going to spend, I think the way that I'll do this is that these standard, very standard results that you have come across already, I'm sure all of you have come across these things. I'm not going to sort of spend too much time talking about these things again. Okay, but you're supposed to, all of your PhD students, I think most of you, some of you have finished your PhD, and these kind of things you must have seen earlier. What I'll try to emphasize is, in some sense, ideas that you may not have thought about earlier. So for example, this is one of them. The real differentiability of functions from R2 to R2 versus complex differentiability of functions from C to C. Okay, what is the dichotomy between these two? Okay, there's some way that they have to be compatible. So you have Cauchy-Riemann equations. Du by dx is dv by dy, du by dy is minus dv by dx if f is holomorphic, and therefore you immediately get that if u and v are differentiable, then d2u by dx squared plus d2u by dy squared is 0, is the same thing. The real parts and the imaginary parts are harmonic. Harmonic means what? Harmonic means that they are in the kernel of this d2 by dx squared plus d2 by dy squared is called the Laplacian. So real and imaginary parts of holomorphic functions are harmonic. Okay, this is just a way of saying these things. Okay, very good. Of course, I have to assume here that u and v are differentiable, but that follows very easily a bit further on that okay, the real and imaginary parts are continuously differentiable, and therefore they'll be harmonic. So the converse question is that if you have u and v from R2 to R, which are continuously differentiable and which satisfy the Cauchy-Riemann equation, then can you say that f is holomorphic? That means, does the derivative of f as a complex number, does it exist? Okay. And this again is, it has to be true. I mean, if it is, I mean, the conditions that you have, that, I mean, it's not really a condition because, anyway, the converse will be the theorem that if you have f is u plus iv, where u and v are continuously differentiable and satisfy the Cauchy-Riemann equations, then f is holomorphic. You know, all these are very standard theorems, which I hope that you will have a look at. You know, it's given in all the books in any case, and it's good to understand this. Okay. So again, I'm not going to prove that. And then the question is that, do there exist u and v which satisfy the Cauchy-Riemann equations, that they are differentiable? Okay. So the question is, can you find two functions u and v from R2 to R, each of them are from R2 to R, which do satisfy the Cauchy-Riemann equations and which are such that f equal to u plus iv is not holomorphic? Okay. So in some sense, this is the converse to what I'm saying, that if you have, I mean, is the converse true, that if u and v satisfy Cauchy-Riemann equations, but you remove this business that it is continuously differentiable, all you know is that it is differentiable. Okay, and u and v satisfy the Cauchy-Riemann equations, can you conclude that f equal to u plus iv is holomorphic, complex differentiability? What do people think about this? Do you think that it should be true? Do you understand what I'm saying? If u and v are continuously differentiable, then f equal to u plus iv is holomorphic. Okay. The question I'm asking is that, can you find u and v which are differentiable? And if it is, can you conclude that f equal to u plus iv is holomorphic? Have anyone thought about this? Any suggestions? Some of you may have come across this earlier. Yes? No? I mean, everyone knows that the real and imaginary, this Cauchy-Riemann equations have to be true and they're differentiable, etc., etc. Okay, continuously differentiable. But the question is that if all you know is that u and v are differentiable functions from R2 to R, which satisfy the Cauchy-Riemann equations, can you conclude that f equal to u plus iv is holomorphic? And I hope that, so I hope you'll start thinking about this. Again, it's something that should be thought about, okay? That, what can you say about this setup? And how will you construct? And is the answer yes or no?
Yeah. Here we are allowing. Hello?
Pardon me?
Yeah. So here we are allowing differentiability, but not continuous.
Yes.
Differentiably.
Yes.
Continuously
Yes.
differentiable. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So I was thinking about modulus, but anyways.
No, modulus doesn't work.
Yeah, it won't work.
So it's good for you to think about such questions. Okay. And the particular example is not very difficult either. Okay. And it'll be good to figure out. See, please tell me if you can come across. First of all, what do you think? The answer is yes or no. And if I'm making a fuss by purely psychological reasons, you should understand that the answer is that just differentiability is not enough. Okay.
Yeah.
That so you must come up with an example where it is differentiability is not enough. You also need the continuity. So what is the example that you will come up with? Okay, and can you find it somewhere? So it is there in the literature, and you should try to find out what the example is. Okay, and of course there are a whole series of examples about that. So, and this is what I mean by saying that, you know, what I'm saying is nothing new to you, but even at this level, there are questions that you should be thinking about. Okay. And there are questions that when you read a book, there are questions that should be occurring in your mind as you read the book. Okay. Even if the book has not asked these questions should arise in your mind as soon as you're reading it. You must understand that reading a book is not a passive exercise. Reading a book is a very active exercise. You yourself have to be participating in it, not just reading it. Anyway, that is again some philosophy kind of thing, but let's see now. Now, what do I want to do? Do there exist? So this is an example. The answer is yes, there do exist such functions u and v. And how would one want to construct it? Okay. So power series, everyone knows these power series, e to the z, z to the n over n factorial, cos z, sin z, etc. And you can write one in terms of the other. And so the question is, if you're given a power series, okay, and you can find an R such that there's a radius of convergence there. It's uniformly convergence for mod z less than little r less than big R, and it diverges for mod z greater than R, and it converges uniformly. This is one part which is sort of obvious in the proof, but one doesn't quite state it so explicitly, that this converges uniformly. This is convergent for mod z less than R, that radius of convergence. But the point is that it converges uniformly on a slightly smaller region. And this you're going to see is going to happen over and over again, okay? You have something in a bigger region that is nice, but on a much smaller, on a slightly arbitrarily smaller region, the function is much nicer, okay? It converges uniformly in any region, slightly smaller region, okay? So here actually I could have put mod z less than or equal to R. Because then you have, what will you have? You'll have uniform convergence on compact sets. Okay, so I should have been even slightly better here. In page 6, please note this. I could have written in part 3 that it converges uniformly for any region mod z less than or equal to R, little r, less than big R, for any 0 less than R less than R. Okay. So this uniform convergence on compact sets is something that makes life nice for us. Okay. And I'm sure you would have come across places where uniform convergence on compact sets is needed. Maybe you haven't, but there's a certain topology that one can define on a space of functions. Okay. And you probably won't see in this topology class, but somewhere you will come across this topology of uniform convergence on compact sets. Okay. Anyway, and what is R? R is given by, everyone knows this, that it's lim sup mod an to the 1 over n. And I hope all of you are familiar with what these properties of lim sup are and lim inf are. Okay. And it's a standard business that if you have mod z less than capital R, okay, then let epsilon be slightly bigger than L, and such that L times mod Z, L plus epsilon mod Z, which I call R, is less than 1. Okay, because mod Z is less than R. And then because it's a lim sup, you'll have that for n sufficiently large that inequality is true. And therefore, an is less than L plus epsilon to the n, which is less than 1. Anz to the n is less than, is R to the n, which is less than 1, and therefore it converges. Okay. Very good. So this is very standard business. All of you have seen it. Okay. But what you should also be worried about is what happens when mod Z is equal to R. So this above theorem, the previous theorem of mod Z less than R, does not handle. It tells you that it is convergent in the smaller ball and outside smaller circle, and outside that circle, it is divergent. Okay. It doesn't tell you what happens on the circle. And what happens on the circle also is important. That something is convergent inside the circle, something is divergent outside the circle, and you have all read this somewhere or the other, and you've seen the proof, all of you have seen the proof. But then when you see this proof, the question you should ask, what you should be thinking about is, what happens on the circle? Okay, what can you say occurs on the circle? Or can you say anything in the places where it converges, places where it diverges, places where it oscillates? Okay, so what can you say on the circle? And I hope you understand that this actually is a interesting or important question. So as soon as you read something like this, the question that you should be continuously asking questions like this. Okay, something converges mod Z less than R, something diverges mod Z greater than R. What happens at mod Z equal to R? And come up with examples to show that anything can happen there. It can be convergent at some points, it can be divergent at some points, it can oscillate at some points. Okay, on mod Z equal to R. Okay, so you have to, another thing you should think about is come up with examples where the power series, I'll put R equal to 1, it doesn't really matter. Power series converges for mod Z less than 1, diverges for mod Z greater than 1, and on mod Z equal to 1, there are places where it converges, places where it diverges, and places where it oscillates. Okay. So that's actually an interesting question, to come up with examples there. And then this is a standard business that if you have something which is holomorphic, it's differentiable at every point for mod Z less than R. Okay. And you take the derivative of that series term by term, then you know that this is also holomorphic for mod Z. The series converges and it's holomorphic for mod Z less than R, and the derivative of f at Z is equal to g of Z. You can differentiate. So what is this theorem saying? This theorem is saying that you can differentiate term by term. Okay, so term by term differentiation is allowed. And this is your classic epsilon by 3 argument. Okay, you break it up into, you take f z naught plus h minus f z naught minus gz, and you break it up into 3 terms. Okay, it's the epsilon by 3 argument that you have seen many times. Okay, again, this is very standard stuff. So I'm not really going to do it, but I mean, you can have the error term and show that the error term converges to 0. And the first 2 terms for polynomials, you know that this is true. Okay, I mean, if the power series is a polynomial, you know that you can differentiate term by term. And then use this epsilon by 3 argument to say that you can this series converges. Okay, and therefore immediately you get that the power series is infinitely often complex differentiable. Okay, and the kth order power series is you take the kth order derivative of each of those summands and you sum them up, and then it is convergent. Okay, this is very standard stuff. So basically we are going to sort of be following in some sense, in a very loose sense, we are going to be following this book by Stein and Chakravarty. And the other, of course, is your standard Conway. I mean, the places where Conway talks in a more geometric manner than Stein and Chakravarty. So you'll see this next time itself. But both these books are, of course, Conway, of course, is the classic book. Conway Complex Analysis is the classic book on complex analysis, the first course in complex analysis. And Stein and Chakravarty, of course, is an excellent book also, but slightly different things. The point of view is slightly different, okay? Which of course is important, but again, the point of view reflects the preferences or of the person writing it. So, I mean, both these books are very good, and there are, of course, many other books. So you can, all these things I'm sure that you have seen earlier, but here itself, there are questions that you have to worry about. What happens on the circle of convergence? I mean, at the circle of convergence. You know, it's convergent inside that and divergent outside that. What happens at that point? And you know, this kind of question actually arises in quite a few different contexts. Okay, you have something that happens inside a set. You have something that happens outside the set. Both these things are easy to understand. Okay, but what happens on that set? Okay, what happens on the boundary? Boundary behavior of complex functions, complex analytic functions on regions can be very complicated. Okay, and you know, that is where there's a lot of complex dynamical systems that worry about what happens. I mean, the boundary behavior, what happens at the boundary. Anyway, that's a separate issue. We won't talk about that. Okay, so the point here is that you have to be worried about what happens at the boundary. Okay, so a function is analytic. We say that a function from omega to c is analytic if it has a convergent power series expansion. Okay, z not equal to 0 at every point. Okay, and what we have shown is that an analytic function is holomorphic. Okay, and all of you know that holomorphic is differentiable, and all of you know that there's a theorem that that is again a standard theorem in complex analysis, which says that if it is differentiable on an open set, okay, at every point on an open set, then if a function from omega to c is differentiable on omega, is holomorphic on omega, then it is analytic. Okay. So a holomorphic function, sorry, let me say this again. What I'm showing here is that what I'm sort of reminding you is that power series expansions, which are analytic functions, okay, are holomorphic. The immediate question that you should ask is, at this stage itself, is that, so what we are saying here is that the analytic functions are holomorphic. And the question you should ask is, are holomorphic functions analytic? Analytic means what? Analytic I've said here. Analytic means that it has a power series expansion, convergent power series expansion with a positive radius of convergence. Okay. So if something can be expressed as a power series expansion, convergent, then we say it is analytic. And what we know is that if it is analytic, then it's differentiable, is what I've just sort of reminded you just now. So analytic function is holomorphic, and the question you want to ask is, are holomorphic functions analytic? Okay. And most of you know that the answer is yes. We'll come to that in a little while. Okay. Every holomorphic, every differentiable function, in fact, has a power series expansion, okay, around a point, which is convergent and some positive radius of convergence around that point. Okay, so we'll come to this a bit later on. It's again one of those results that should be quite startling in some sense. Why should this be true? And the question is that you can ask the same question for functions from R2 to R2, or for functions from R to R. Why do you want to do it from R2? Okay, so if you have a function from R to R, and it is analytic in some region, okay, then it is, that means it has a positive power series expansion. Then by the same argument that you have here, you can differentiate term by term, and therefore analytic function from R to R is infinitely differentiable, okay, as a function from R to R. So the question you should be asking is that if you have a function from R to R that is infinitely differentiable, you know, at every point somewhere or the other, it's infinitely differentiable at every point in R, can you conclude that the function has a power series expansion at every point in R? Okay. And I hope some of you have thought about this. What do you think the answer should be? Where am I now? I should be here. Yeah. So my question now is, yeah.
Okay. The answer is like actually no. Yeah.
And what is the example?
We have the famous function
e to the minus 1 by x for x greater than equal to greater than 0, and 0 otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have to show. So this is one of the exercises I've given there. Okay, in this next set of exercises is that this function, you have to prove that this function is differentiable at every point, because the only point you are worried about is the point 0, because everywhere else it's differentiable. Okay. And you want to show that the derivative at 0, all the derivatives at 0 are 0. Okay. So, and therefore this thing cannot have a power series expansion. So therefore you'll have a function which is infinitely differentiable from R to R, but the function is doesn't have a power series expansion around 0. Okay. So this is one of the major differences between complex analytic functions and real analytic functions. Okay. So I hope you people will do this exercise. It's again, that exercise is again one of those exercises that you do once in your lifetime, and to actually show that all the derivatives at 0 are 0 for that function, it requires a little bit of work. Okay. So and once of course you have one, you have everything. Okay, so I mean, this function is actually useful in many other contexts also, and one has to, use this, for example, in the partition of Unity business and whatever. So there is something there to be understood. Okay, so where is this going? No, I should just minimize this. Okay, then I minimize this. So what happens, which is infinitely differentiable? Is it analytic? The answer is no. Okay, and this is one of those examples, e to the minus 1 by x squared. I put, you could also have e to the minus 1 by x, and this is not analytic. Okay. So, okay, so much for that. Now, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about integration over paths. Okay. So a function is called a parameterized curve. It is differentiable. I mean, that means that gamma is continuously differentiable as a function from real numbers to complex numbers. So gamma t plus h minus gamma t divided by h, where h now is a real number, limit h tend to 0 exists and is continuous. Okay. And of course, this is what you mean by a parameterized curve. So notice here, I do not want just continuous gammas. I want continuously differentiable gammas. Okay. So the curves that we are talking about have to be continuously differentiable. That means the derivatives must exist at every point and the derivatives must be continuous. Now, one has to be slightly careful with this business because you do have what are called space filling curves. Okay. And we don't want to integrate over a curve that is space filling. Okay. So you would want to integrate over curves in C, which are continuously differentiable curves when you think of them as a map from A, B to C. Okay, so this is the first statement. We say that gamma is smooth if gamma is continuously differentiable. Gamma is piecewise smooth. Means piecewise smooth will mean what? It means that you cut it into pieces, and in those pieces, it is smooth. Okay. So for example, if you take this boundary of a square, by the way, it is an interesting exercise. What do you have to show that this boundary of a square, okay, which is 0, 1 cross 0, 1, the boundary of that. So what I want is 0, 1 cross 0 union, what is it? Union what? 1, comma 0, 1, etc. The boundary of the square, A, B, C, D, if that is the vertices that I have there. So it's a certain curve. My question is that, is it a smooth curve? Okay. The way I define it, okay, it is not, in the obvious way that you would define it, it is not going to be the parameterization gamma is not going to be differentiable. Because you cut it into 4 parts. The first part you do the horizontal lower line, then vertical right line, then horizontal top line, and then vertical left line. Okay. So the obvious parameterization that you're going to use, okay, is piecewise differentiable. Okay. And at these nodes, this business is going to be continuous. So that is what I mean by piecewise smooth. If it is continuous and it is smooth on, AR to AR plus 1, just worry about what you should understand what is meant by the closed interval, smooth on a closed interval. Smooth on a closed interval means that it is differentiable on the right at one end and differentiable from the left at the other end. That's all. Okay. So it is clear that the square, the way that you would normally parameterize it, is not a smooth continuously differentiable function. Okay, the whatever parameterization that you would normally give is not smooth because the derivatives at those four corners do not match. Okay, but here itself there's an interesting question to ask. Okay, the parameterization that you will choose is not smooth. The parameterization that you choose is piecewise smooth. Okay, the question you should ask is, does there exist a smooth parameterization? Does there exist a differentiable parameterization? Has anyone thought about this? Is it clear what I'm asking? So you have this square, and you know that there's a parameterization of that boundary, which is piecewise smooth. Okay. The question I want to ask is there any parameterization of the boundary of the square that is smooth, that is differentiable? What do you think? And the obvious answer should be are you with me or are you not with me? 55 people. Someone should tell me something.
No, it should not be.
It should not be, okay, because of those squares. Okay, it will be continuous at those squares, but there should not be any differentiability there. So they should not exist any smooth parameterization of the boundary of the square. Okay, or any such thing. Okay, you look at that mod v fx equal to mod x. There should not be any smooth parameterization of the graph of f. Okay, mod x. And the question is, how would you think you would prove it? Okay, and then you have to sort of spend a little bit of time that why such a thing be true. So again, there is a little bit of thing to be done there. Okay, and you see, I want to talk about the integral of a function. So the point is that there can be many parameterizations for the same curve. Okay, so gamma 1 and gamma 2 are equivalent parameterizations of the curve if gamma 1 and gamma 2 are equivalent parameterizations of the curve if there exists a phi. So gamma 1 is from AB to C, gamma 2 is from CD to C. We say that they're equivalent, or gamma 2 is a reparameterization of gamma 1 if there exists this phi which maps CD to AB, okay, such that phi is increasing, okay, and differentiable. I should have put it differentiable here also. Okay, phi is so what I want is that the derivative of phi is never zero, and if it is never zero, then it should either be always positive or always negative. Okay, the sign of phi, the derivative should not change, and I want to have that phi is increasing. That means the sign of the derivative is always positive. What I need here is actually, I should have written that down, that phi is not just continuous. What have I written? I haven't written anything. Okay, so which is not good. I should have written here that phi must be differentiable and always non-zero. Okay, if it is always non-zero, then it is either always positive or always negative, and I must show that I must have that phi is, the derivative is always positive, and therefore phi is increasing. So there exists a phi. So we say these are reparameterizations. So gamma 1 or gamma 2 is a reparameterization of gamma 1 if there exists a phi such that gamma 2 of S is gamma 1 of phi of S. Okay, and what do I have there? Gamma 1 of phi of S. Okay, so we are saying that Gamma 1 is a reparametrization of gamma 2 with the same orientation. So you have to be worried about the direction. Now, this is something that happens in intervals. You have an interval AB. The interval AB is not just the set, okay, of points from A to B. It is a set of points from A to B with a direction, because the real numbers have a God-given direction, okay? The real numbers have the direction that you go from left to right. So there is a certain order that is involved there. So one of the exercises that are there a bit later on is to say that in complex numbers, there is no order. Okay, yeah, I come to that a little late. So A to B, this interval A to B is not just the set, but it has an order. Namely, you're going from A, the smaller thing, to B, which is the larger thing. Okay, so not just A to B, I should put A to B with an arrow, which tells me the direction in which I'm going from over the set AB. I'm going from the smaller thing to the bigger thing. Okay. So why am I making a fuss about this? So what I want is that phi is increasing. That means the derivative of phi is greater than 0. Okay. And that is saying that when S goes from increases from C to D, so I should have drawn arrows here. Okay, I have not drawn the arrows, unfortunately. I should have drawn the arrows. And I should say that when you go from C to D in that direction, increasing from C to D, okay, then phi of, when S increases from C to D, then phi of S should increase from A to B. This is the increasing business that is important. Okay. So phi is increasing from A to B. And that is the business of orientation. Okay. I don't want the reverse thing to happen. I don't want it to go from B to A. Okay. So if F is from omega to C, omega is some region, and gamma is a curve in omega, I will define integral of fz dz to be equal to integral of f of gamma t, gamma prime t dt, if gamma is smooth. And if gamma is not smooth, but it is piecewise smooth, that means gamma, I can break up the interval into subintervals AR plus 1. I can break up the whole interval AB into these subintervals. And I will define it to be equal to sum over the subintervals of f of gamma t, gamma prime t dt. Okay. So this is what I mean by that integral. And then, of course, remember, I want to say it is the integral over gamma, but you can reparameterize gamma. Okay. So what I must show is that this integral does not change when I reparameterize the curve gamma. Okay. So what is it that you want to show? You want to show that if you have a change of variables, okay. So you have gamma 1 is equal to, what do I have here? Reparameterization, gamma 1 and gamma 2. So gamma 1 of t and gamma 2 of s is gamma 1 of phi of s. Okay, phi of s is my t. And then because phi is increasing, one can show that this particular sum does not depend on the parameterization that you choose. Okay. It's nearly time to stop for this first session. And I think in any case, people need breaks. So yeah, I think we'll stop for 10-15 minutes. There's supposed to be everyone. Questions from anyone so far? Yeah. No. Okay, so let's continue now. Here we are. Go down here and minimize this. So the point here is that if you change variables, okay, this is sort of saying that the integral is the same no matter which parameterization that one chooses, okay, and this is well defined independent of the parameterization that you choose. That means if gamma 1 and gamma 2 are equivalent parameterizations of the curve gamma, then the integral of gamma 1 is the integral of gamma 2. Okay, so this is the change of variables formula. And the question is, what is the change of variables formula? And you know, this is actually another one of those things where most people are quite confused over what the change of variables formula is. Okay, so this is a good place to sort of make you think about it. So we are given a function f from a subset A contained in Rn to R. And phi is a change of variables which goes from a set B to the set A. What is the meaning of a change of variables? It means that it is a diffeomorphism and the derivative of phi at x is invertible for all x in B. Diffeomorphism means that the derivative exists and the derivative is invertible for all x in B. Okay. So the change of variables formula tells you that. So what we have here is the change of variables formula, where instead of looking at real numbers on this side, you have complex numbers, but all you can do is separate out the real and imaginary parts, and you're integrating each of those parts, real and imaginary parts, separately. That is what I mean by this integral. So the question I want to ask is, what is the change of variables formula? I'm going to spend some time trying to come out with an answer. So what do you think the change of variables formula in that setup? Which setup? This setup. The setup is that you have a set A contained in Rn. Suppose the sets are nice, don't worry about the quality of the sets. Suppose the sets are nice and you have function f from A contained in Rn to R, and phi is a diffeomorphism from a set B to the set A. Okay. The change of variables formula tells you that. Okay. So I want you to come up with the change of variables formula. What is it? Can you tell me in that setup? Start thinking about it. Oh, yeah, someone who will tell me what the change of variables are. It's difficult for you to explain because you don't have a camera, but at least you should talk about it, and then I can correct you as you're talking. Now, what is the change of variables formula? All of you have seen it earlier. You've done it for R2. Okay. So from Rn, what should I write down? No. Maybe I should leave it for you to think about and submit assignments if I want to do that. So please think about it. You should, I mean, again, this is one of those things that actually people are quite confused over. Okay. How do you write down what the change of variables formula is for a subset of Rn? Okay, A and B are contained in Rn, and the change of variables formula says something. What does it say? Okay, I'll ask you again next time, and if you have difficulties about that, you please tell me what difficulties you have. Okay, so what do I want to do? I want to minimize this. Okay, please think about what it is. It's worthwhile trying to get these ideas straight in your mind. Okay. And of course, in all these things, the first step in understanding that these things are important is to understand, first of all, that you have some difficulties in this kind of thing, because I'm pretty sure that no one would have told you that please worry about what the change of variables formula is. And then, of course, if you're doing, most of you are doing PhDs, is what I understand. Some of you have finished your PhDs. And I hope that you will spend a little bit of time trying to read the proof of the change of variables formula. Okay, it is actually quite involved. Okay, and it's worthwhile reading this. Okay, the reason I said this because we are talking about change of variables for integral over curves in the complex plane. Okay, so please think about this. Now here I have a series of exercises that again, please start thinking about these. This is not that easy to think about, but there are things that you will understand that even these basic ideas are useful in very many contexts. Okay, so the first exercise is that there does not exist any total ordering on C. On real numbers, there is a total ordering. There is the set of positive numbers, a subset, and what are the properties that this positive cone, whatever you mean by that, satisfies. So there is a ordering on real numbers, okay? Of course, which respects the field structure for real numbers. Okay, real numbers are a field. So whenever you're talking about an order, the order that you are talking about must respect the field structure of real numbers. And of course, I mean, I'm sure you have seen this at some point of time, that on the complex numbers, you cannot find such an ordering. Okay. So the question, what is an ordered field? What is a real ordered field? Why is the complex numbers not an ordered field? Okay. So there's something to be done there to understand it, and it's not clear what. So here itself, this needs to, you have to understand a little bit about what it means to be a ordered field. Okay. And again, this comes into questions of algebra. What is a real ordered field? C is not an ordered field. Okay. So please think about this, about what does this statement mean. So I'm going to go through these exercises and at least explain a little bit about them. Okay, even though I'm not going to solve the exercises, and I believe Sagar and Kaushik, okay, will help you think about these exercises. And again, they can't really do, they only have 2 problem sessions in the week. And I think the problem sessions that I have the problem sessions that problems that I've already given you in the first lot and the second lot probably are enough for the whole 6 weeks that you have. But again, these are problems that will help you think about your ideas and clarify your ideas in some way or the other. So this is another important idea. The second one is that what are called Blaschke products. Okay, this is not a product, it's a single function. Okay, and it turns out that these functions are important. And in fact, products of these functions are important. So there's something called a Blaschke product, which is a product of factors like that. Fz is equal to W minus Z over 1 minus W bar Z. Okay, and if for W in C, okay, so fix a W in the unit disk and look at this function F, which takes Z, W minus Z over 1 minus W bar Z. And again, this is why I want to say that we must try to understand geometrically what this function does. Okay, and that's why you could write a program yourself and try to see how the pictures evolve. But this has already been done. The software is available. It's worthwhile to understand what this function does to various regions, to various lines, to various circles or some contours. What does F do to a contour is the kind of question that you're interested in. What does F do to a region? So there's a picture that is involved with this function F. And you have to spend some time trying to understand what that picture is. Okay. So what is the exercise? The fact that it is holomorphic and it's bijective. Okay, on the unit disk. So F first of all maps the unit disk. Remember, I'm fixing W in the unit disk. And the statement is that F maps D to D. So if Z is in D, then Fz is in D. The function is holomorphic, that is clear. Okay, and the function is bijective. Okay, and what is the inverse? So it's a bijective function from D to D. D is mod Z less than 1. And not just that, it maps the unit circle to the unit circle. Okay, so you see there are pictures involved beyond functions which map unit disk to itself, but it should also map the boundary of the unit disk to the boundary of the unit disk. Okay, and then we are worried about what happens near the boundary. So anyway, so this is the exercise that show that F maps D to D, and it maps the boundary of D to the boundary of D, the unit circle to the unit circle. Okay, and there's this whole area, again, this is quite central to all of complex analysis, where you're talking about products of Blaschke functions. They're called Blaschke products. Okay, then of course there's another exercise. You know about what is meant by the Cauchy-Riemann equations when you have Euclidean coordinates, x and y coordinates. However, instead of x and y, you could also have r theta coordinates. So f of z, which is f of x, y, can also be thought about as f of r theta. Okay, r is equal to square root of x squared plus y squared. Theta is equal to tan inverse y by x on some region. Okay, let's not worry about that. So r theta are polar coordinates. And the question is, you know what the Cauchy-Riemann equations are in the xy coordinates. And then the question is, what are the Cauchy-Riemann equations in the polar coordinates? Okay. Now this turns out to be an important exercise because you should be worried about what? Harmonic functions which are spherically symmetric. Okay. So what is the meaning of what are Cauchy-Riemann equations? Okay, for harmonic functions, for spherically symmetric functions. So this change of variables actually, okay, tells you that Cauchy-Riemann equations should change in the new variables. The question is, how do they change? Okay. And you will begin to understand that doing these kind of calculations, there's nothing difficult in this calculation. Again, it's one of those calculations that everyone who's doing mathematics should do once in their lifetime. Okay. And if you understand what's going on, then it'll be very useful for you to see what happens later on. Okay. Because this change of variables business, this is again a change of variables. XY going to R theta, or R theta going to XY. And then you have a certain equation in the XY coordinates. And therefore, what are the corresponding equations in the R theta coordinates? So again, this is a question of how do these differential operators change when you change the variables that are involved. Okay, so I don't know if I talked about d by dz and d by dz bar. I think this is a gap. Do I have it? Let me just one moment, just wait a moment. Let me see if I've talked about d by dz and d by dz bar. I think I have. I have, okay. So d by dz of f is d by dx plus 1 over I d by dy with a 1/2. And d by dz bar of f, bad notation, is d by dx minus 1 over I d by dy of f. I've forgotten the f there. Okay. So the statement is that f is holomorphic if and only if d by dz bar of f is 0. Okay. F is holomorphic and f prime z is this, and df by dz bar, which is d by dx minus 1 over I d by dy of f, that f I've forgotten there, is 0. Okay. So the operators d by dz and d by dz bar, okay, are differential operators. They are derivatives. Okay. And a lot of the things that one is saying in complex analysis can also be written in terms of the operators d by dz and d by dz bar. The operator d by dz is d by dx plus 1 over I d by dy with a 1/2 stuck in front, and d by dz bar is d by dx minus 1 over I d by dy with a 1/2 stuck in front. Okay. It turns out that these operators are actually very important. Okay. And they're important in their own right. Of course, you can write d by dz. So d by dx can be expressed in terms of d by dz and d by dz bar. D by dy can be expressed in terms of d by dz and d by dz bar. It just follows from these equations. Okay. And a function is holomorphic if df by dz bar is 0. A function is anti-holomorphic. A function f is anti-holomorphic. There's some word for it. I think the word is anti-holomorphic if df by dz is 0. Okay. So there are holomorphic functions and there are anti-holomorphic functions. Holomorphic means df by dz bar is 0. Anti-holomorphic is that d by dz of f is 0. So these operators also are very important, and obviously you can talk about the derivative in terms of these operators. Good, I was worried whether I had mentioned this or not, but I have. Okay. So to come back to that exercise, here. Okay. So the point is that d by dz bar is equal to d by dz bar, d by dz. These two commute. These two operators commute. And 4 times that is delta. It's always denoted by delta, which is d2 by dx squared plus d2 by dy squared. And you know that this is called the Laplacian operator. So the Laplacian also is expressed in terms of d by dz and d by dz bar. And it turns out that this also is a very important idea. Okay. The fact that the Laplacian is in terms of d by dz and d by dz bar, this idea is used in quite a few different places in mathematics. Okay. So f is holomorphic, then u and v are harmonic. That is okay. Okay. So, you have seen the radius of convergence of the exponential function of sine z and cos z and whatever. But a large number of very important functions are expressed in terms of a power series. Okay. There are these things called hypergeometric functions, hypergeometric series, okay, of which a particular case, of course, is the Bessel function. And all these functions are expressed in terms of a power series. Okay. So the exercise here is write down what this hypergeometric series is. Okay. And you have to show where that series is convergent. And there are many such things that are very important. Okay. Hypergeometric series, and then there's things called the f functions and the g functions, g series, f series, whatever there is. So a lot of these functions are defined in terms of series, and you have to worry about what is the radius of convergence. Okay. Now this also is more or less obvious, the next statement, that if you have, we say that the function has a primitive if the derivative of capital F is little f. Okay. And a consequence of, so this is a consequence again of this exercise again is a consequence of the fundamental theorem of calculus. It's a consequence of Stokes' theorem, if you wish. So actually, so I should mention this also. These integrals or whatever are what give rise to Stokes' theorem. Okay, and the simplest example, of course, of Stokes' theorem is the fundamental theorem of calculus. Whatever, fundamental theorem of differential calculus, integral calculus. And the point is that when you integrate the derivative of a function over some path, you get the value of the function at the two endpoints. Okay, this is the fundamental theorem of calculus. And therefore, as a consequence, you get that 1 over z does not have a primitive. If it had a primitive, then the left-hand side, the right-hand side will be 0 when you integrate it over the circle. The integral of the left-hand side over the circle is not 0. Unit circle. Okay. So this idea again is first telling you that 1 over z satisfies something. It does not have a function capital F. And again, those of you who have seen it earlier will recognize that this has something to do with Stokes' theorem, fundamental theorem of calculus. So this again is one of the questions that I think one of you had asked a little while ago. What happens when you reverse the orientation? Okay. Now reversing the orientation means what? You have gamma, which is some curve which goes from gamma A to gamma B. Its value at A to value at B along that interval A to B. Okay. Now I'm going to reverse that gamma. That means I want to traverse that image in the reverse direction. So I want to define the reverse or inverse or whatever you like, opposite path. So the opposite path should have the same image as the path gamma, but it should traverse gamma, it should go along gamma in the opposite direction. So if gamma is from A to B to C is some curve, all these are differentiable and etc. etc. Then the reverse thing is say that let gamma tilde be a map from AB to C, such that gamma tilde of T is gamma of B plus A minus T. Notice that when T is equal to A, gamma tilde of A is gamma of B, and T is equal to B, gamma tilde of B is gamma of A, and therefore you're going to cover that path in the reverse direction. Gamma goes from gamma A to gamma B, gamma tilde goes from gamma B to gamma A. Gamma B is the initial point. By the way, this initial point and end points are things that are actually turn out to be important. Okay. So gamma tilde is called the reverse of gamma. It's called gamma with the opposite orientation. And what does this exercise say? It says that if you reverse the orientation, then the integrals change signs. Okay. Integral over gamma is equal to integral over gamma tilde with a sign. It's more or less obvious when you write this down. Okay. You have to be slightly careful about that integral, integral from A to B, integral from, basically it boils down to saying that integral from A to B is minus the integral from B to A. Okay. And you have to be slightly careful when you want to say that it's an integral over the interval AB. Okay. So one has to be slightly careful there. Now, so when you reverse the orientation, the integral changes sign. And this is the idea that is going to be used to actually prove the first version of Cauchy's theorem or Goursat's theorem, which says that if you go along an edge in both directions, okay, you have an edge and you take the integral around from one to the edge, one point to the other along that edge, and you go along that same integral with the opposite direction. The sum of these two is going to be 0. Integral over gamma plus integral over gamma tilde of fz dz is 0. These two integrals cancel each other out. Okay. And it turns out that that is an important idea. That when you have these things and you have an edge, you have some region, you draw a line and you go along that line in one direction, or you go along that line in the other direction, and you add them up, and these two sums, these two summands cancel each other out. Okay. And therefore, with the same idea, you can do the same thing with gamma to the n, where gamma is a circle. Integral, evaluate integral of z to the n dz over gamma. And then what gamma do you choose? You choose gamma to be a circle containing the origin or a circle not containing the origin. Okay. And therefore, you know that the answer of one is some 2 pi I and the other answer to the other is 0. Okay. So the first thing is, I mean, it's more or less easy. It's more or less immediate what happens there. Okay. What is n? I've not told you what value n takes. Okay. So I should also add there. What is n? Now what happens when you have this quadratic thing in the denominator? Z minus a to z minus b. Okay, over a certain region. Then the next thing is this formula, which actually is going to be used a bit later on, which is called the summation by paths for finite sums, finite sequences. Okay. And the statement is that the sum of a and bn is an times the sum for b, capital N, minus am b, capital B, m minus 1. And then you have this product term, an plus 1 minus an times bn. And the question here, this is obvious, okay? It's sort of very easy to see that this is true. Various things are cancelling. All that this is saying is that various terms are cancelling. But of course, it's not. Once you have this formula, to prove that it is true is not difficult. Question is that how do you come up with this formula in the first place? And then why is it called summation by parts? Obviously, you have seen, and this again is one of the drawbacks that we have the way we teach. We have taught you about, I mean, obviously it's called summation by parts because there's something called integration by parts. Okay, all of you know about integration by parts. First function integral f times j, first function integral of the first function, derivative of the second, blah 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 blah, and you have the two end terms. Okay, so all of you know about integral by parts, integration by parts, but quite a few of you I think would not be familiar with summation by parts. And obviously summation by parts should be much more straightforward than integration by parts. Okay, so this is a formula that is actually useful. I think we'll come across a place where we will use this a bit later on. Okay, so, and this last exercise is something that I had sort of started talking about, and one of you have told me the answer, which is very good. Okay, that you take some function from R2 to R3. I hope you understand that when I write down the function like that, I'm not really interested in x1 squared x2 or e to the x1 plus x3 or cos of x1 x2. Okay, but the point is that you must be able to tell me what the derivative is. Okay, so find the derivative of f at x, find the second derivative of f at 1, 2, evaluate it at 3, 4, evaluate it at 5, 6, and here, where should the answer lie? The answer for B should be, can anyone tell me what the answer of B should be? No. The second derivative of f at the point 1, 2, evaluated at 3, 4, evaluated at 5, 6, should be what? No. Come on. Some of you should know this. Someone had answered this. And there are people present who were students in a course that I had taught who should know what the answer is. Huh?
Sir, and that will be in linear map from.
Who's answering? By the way, I can't see it here. Who is telling me the answer?
Sir, no.
Arnav. You are answering. Okay. Oh, Datta, Arnav Datta. Okay. You have the same symbol still. Huh? Okay. So the answer should be what? Which is not very fair because you were present in the course when I taught it. But anyway, what do you think the answer is?
Sir, that will be in linear map from R2 to R3 actually.
That's wrong.
No, sir, like that is a map from linear map from R2 to linear map from R2 to R3.
So that answer is where? The thing that I'm asking, where does it live? Second derivative of f at 1, 2, evaluated at 3, 4, evaluated at 4, 5 is what?
It's a matrix. It's a matrix of real numbers. 3 cross 2 matrix.
Is that right? Be careful.
We are evaluating it, yeah.
Yes. So what should I get?
we will get a real matrix of
this is a point. This is a point that you have to be careful of where things lie at every stage. Okay, and that is why you
Sir, it will
once
be a
you
three
find
tuple.
yes.
So it will be a 3 tuple.
Someone is saying that it is a 3 tuple. Soham, that's Soham, no?
Yeah.
Which is not very fair. Again, you've been present in my class. Okay.
Yes.
So someone is telling me it's a matrix, and someone is telling me that it is a 3 tuple. Means a 3 tuple means it's a vector in R3. Okay. So what are the possible answers? There are various possible answers. I hope you will write down what all the possible answers are, which may be reasonable. But these are two possible answers. One is saying that it is a matrix, 3 by 2 matrix, and someone else is saying that it is a vector in R3. What do you think is correct?
It can't be a vector. I mean, in this case, it can't be a vector because D2 will also be a linear map from one of the Euclidean space to, no, not Euclidean space, but I mean, it can't be a vector.
Why?
I was arguing because D2 will be a map from L.
Be careful of what I'm asking. I'm asking D2F at 1, 2, evaluated at 3, 4, evaluated at 5, 6.
So it will be vector in R3 as we are evaluating it in.
So do you understand that the answer should be a vector? I'm evaluating it at some point. I'm evaluating it, second derivative of f, evaluated at 1, 2, evaluated at 3, 4, evaluated at 5, 6. Okay? And therefore the answer that I'll get will be a vector in R3. Okay? So, I mean, the point here is that this is actually quite confusing. Okay? But the first step in clarifying your confusion is to understand that there is something to be confused about.
So the notation seems to be confusing to me. So
no, why isn't that notation is the correct notation?
So
okay.
So what does this 1, 2 and then 3, 4 and then 5, 6 mean?
No, this is not what I wanted. What did I want? So what is the notation? D2F at some point P in R2. Okay?
Yeah.
So D2F at some point P in R2, the point P is a point 1, 2. Where should that lie?
Oh, okay. And then we are evaluating that thing at 3, 4 and that, okay.
Yes? Yeah, this is the correct notation.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
So again, I want to emphasize that you have to be clear about the notation that you're going to use. Okay? It is the second derivative of f at a point P, evaluated at a vector V. That is a linear map which you evaluate at a vector W. Okay? So these kind of ideas of how exactly one is writing this down and calculating it, okay, turn out to be quite important as it goes. Yeah, and you have to. So first of all, the question is, where does this lie? And it turns out that the answer to this thing is actually a vector in R3. Okay, and the question is, which vector in R3? So you have to be careful about. I mean, you have to understand what is the matrix representation of the derivative. Okay, that involves a choice of basis, and then you have to choose a basis for linear maps from R2 to R3, and then you have to understand what you mean by the derivative of that being a linear map from R2 to R6, where that R6 is understood as linear maps from R2 to R3. So you have to choose a basis of linear maps from R2 to R3. So there's something, the point here is that even though these definitions one is saying is quite straightforward, there is enough here to make you understand that there are things to be more clearly understood. So as I always say in my class, the first step that a teacher should take is to make students understand that they are confused in the first place. Okay? So please be careful of where all these things lie. And that is why it's more important to understand that when you have a function from C to C and you talk about holomorphicity of that function, okay, then you can talk about higher order holomorphicities, whereas all those higher order derivatives of the function f, which will prove it exists, etc., etc. All the higher order derivatives of the function f are complex numbers. Whereas if you think of that function as being a function from R2 to R2, then the higher order derivatives of f evaluated at a point are going to be k multilinear maps. The kth higher order derivative of f is going to be a k multilinear map. And somehow, when you're talking about complex holomorphicity, all those k multilinear maps in fact boil down to a single complex number. Okay, why does that happen is the question that one wants to ask. Okay, so there's something